Time to talk about 80s horror films. Welcome, this is Books Under Your Bed, and I'm Wesley McCraw. I just wanted to give a rundown of a few of my favorite horror films from the 80s. The 80s was a very pivotal year for horror in cinemas. It was the time when VHS was on the rise, which led to a lot of obsessive watching and exposure to younger kids who couldn't see the films in the theater. To start off, my favorite horror film as a kid, and probably the first major one that I saw, was Gremlins. It was released before PG-13 existed, so it was a PG film with some gruesome, scary puppets. One of my favorite scenes in all of horror history is the scene where a gremlin is menacing the mother in the kitchen. That scene always stood out to me as a kid. After that, I just loved being scared by movies, so I sought horror movies out. I personally am not a fan of Halloween or Friday the 13th, or really any super straightforward slasher, but Nightmare on Elm Street was an exception because of the concept of the killer killing people in their sleep. So could have a lot of creative, surreal imagery and situations that a normal slasher couldn't have. I was surprised to learn later when I was watching how it was made, exactly how low budget and cheaply it was made. A lot of it continues to work to this day just because of the context of it being in a dream. So even if something doesn't look completely realistic, it can still capture the fear that people have in their dreams. Definitely worth watching now. It still holds up. I'm not a huge fan of the sequels besides New Nightmare, which came out in the 90s. So I'll talk about that when I do a 90s rundown. Another film from the 80s that I loved was Hellraiser. I've already talked about how I love Clive Barker, and Hellraiser was not my first exposure to him. That was The Thief of Always. But when I did see Hellraiser, I loved it. I like how it's sexy and has a complex plot. A lot of horror movies in the 80s have a very minimal plot, and Hellraiser has multiple plot threads that culminate near the climax of the film. The designs of the creatures are amazing, of the Cenobites. It's also a film that was very tiny budget. The elaborate stop-motion animation scene in the film was actually added after all of the filming, when they were able to convince people to give them a little bit more money for special effects before it came out in theaters. I think the next movie I would like to talk about is a comedic horror film, Evil Dead 2. It actually redoes all of the first film in the first 15 minutes, and then continues from there, going sort of berserk. Sam Raimi, the director, just comes up with a ton of ridiculous ideas to have happen in an isolated cabin, and Bruce Campbell, the main actor of the film, is pretty much game for whatever is thrown at him. A lot of physical comedy, a lot of facial acting, and over-the-top mugging for the camera. It's just a very interesting film that stands out from pretty much anything else in the 80s. The final movie that I want to talk about, I guess, that I can't really leave out is Aliens, the follow-up to Alien, directed by James Cameron. It's masterfully directed. It's the film he did after Terminator. Did a super great job of directing it with a low budget to make it look like something that was a major blockbuster at the time. Yeah, I'm assuming everyone has heard of it, so I don't need to talk about it too much. There's quite a few other important 80s horror films that stand out. Videodrome, Possession, The Thing. So this is really just scratching the surface, but these are some of my personal favorites that I hope you've seen, and if you haven't, you should seek them out. I'm sure I missed some of your favorite horror films from the 80s. The 80s is very popular for horror, so if there's one that you super love, leave it in the comments. I'll try to look at all of those and respond. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch a video about 80s horror. I'll have probably a video about 90s horror in a few weeks' time. Until then, find a good book to read, or if you're not feeling like it, dig back into the 80s and find another cool horror movie.